everyone, for another episode of the Ops Center, where we put a wargamer's focus on historical conflicts. I'm your host, Ariskany, and in this episode we're wrapping up our look at the history, opposing forces, tactics, and wargaming options for the Pacific theater of World War II. If you're just joining us, consider taking a look at our previous episodes, where we looked at the Marine Corps' landings on Iwo Jima, surface gunnery actions in the Pacific, and how carrier operations in the Pacific changed naval warfare forever. Sooner or later, though, you've got to get some sand in your boots. That's right, it's time to launch the Amtraks and hit the beach for a look at the doctrine of island hopping in the Pacific. The roots of the island hopping strategy go down to the very reasons the Pacific War started in the first place. In summary, from 1937, Japan had involved herself in a long war in China, along with disastrous campaigns against the Soviets in 1938 and 39. Very quickly, Japan's leaders realized they didn't have anywhere near the resources needed to win these wars. Such resources were available in Southeast Asia, which meant war with the colonial powers in the region at the time, the UK, France, and the Netherlands. The whole point of the Pearl Harbor attack was to cripple the American Pacific Fleet long enough to allow the Japanese to smash through the Americans in the Philippines and conquer these resource-rich islands and territories in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. Well, it worked. In 6 months, the Japanese conquered tens of thousands of islands, some bigger than Great Britain, others no bigger than a tiny French village. After the Americans turned the tide at the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, the idea that they would, should, or even could reconquer each and every one of these individual islands was quickly dismissed as an impractical impossibility. Thus, the idea of island hopping was born. Island hopping is not just attacking one island and hopping over the water to the next one. Instead, the Americans carefully considered what islands were really important, based on factors like location, predicted Japanese resistance, threat posed to American supply and shipping routes, and the ability of that target island to support the next phase of an overall invasion plan. The Americans would invade that island, then skip the next 10, 20, or 100 islands, leaving the Japanese garrisons there to wither on the vine, as the expression went. Only certain key islands would be hit. Islands that could base aircraft to bomb other targets, naval forces to blockade other targets, and stage troops to assault the next target. The biggest Japanese garrisons were always bypassed, sealed off by the Navy, and bombarded by the Air Force until they just didn't matter anymore. But they were never actually assaulted. In short, island hopping isn't about what you attack, it's about what you don't attack. The United States pursued 2 general island hopping campaigns in the Pacific. The first of these was Army-dominated, led by General Douglas MacArthur in the South Pacific. Starting with Guadalcanal in August 1942, this campaign progressed up the Solomon Islands, then Bougainville, then New Britain, along with a whole series of coordinated landings around the Bismarck Archipelago and the northeast coast of New Guinea. The general objectives here were to defeat the Japanese on New Guinea once and for all and thus lift this threat against Australia, and to surround and isolate the Japanese superbase at Rabaul. Rabaul was a gigantic Japanese military complex on the northern tip of New Britain, with a garrison of up to 100,000 men, a sizable naval base, and powerful air units. Actually taking it would require a landing larger than Normandy, which is why the Americans never undertook the venture. By taking key points around Rabaul and bombing its offensive naval and air infrastructure into rubble, MacArthur was able to bypass Rabaul and continue his drive to the Philippines. The island hopping campaign in the South Pacific was slow, brutal, and exhausting for the Army, Marine, and Australian forces involved. Many battles started in 1944 never officially ended, still in progress when the war ended in September 1945. Merciless malaria, steaming jungle, and soaring mountains were often a deadlier enemy than the Japanese, who also had to contend with a complete lack of support and abject starvation. The islands here are large, so the Allies only wanted to take certain key points on the islands, usually air bases from which the stranglehold on Rabaul could be maintained and tightened. With Rabaul neutralized, however, the South Pacific somewhat turned into an Allied lake, although, again, fighting here never completely ended until war's end. The other big island-hopping campaign was a Navy-dominated drive across the Central Pacific under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz. The objectives here were similar to the South Pacific, a march back toward Japan and to seal off another gigantic center of Japanese power, this time the Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. But the conditions were radically different. Starting with the Gilberts, then the Marshalls, and then the Marianas, these islands were absolutely tiny coral atolls. The distances between these atolls were vast, ruling out land-based tactical air support. Anything air-based had to be done from carriers. And while Normandy, for example, crossed about 100 miles of water, each Central Pacific invasion had to be carried across anywhere from 700 to 1,500 miles of open ocean, with all the logistical and engineering nightmares that come with such an endeavor. And yet, like we saw with Rabaul, Truk itself was bombed, isolated, and rendered irrelevant, but never actually assaulted. Probably the worst of these Central Pacific battles was the first, Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll of the Gilbert Islands. Most of these Central Pacific islands, again, were coral atolls, which means that the water around them can be very shallow. This causes problems not only for naval gunfire support, but also landing craft. This proved true on Bloody Tarawa, where the first waves of Marines hit the beaches on tracked amphibious assault vehicles that could crawl over the surrounding reefs just fine. But the subsequent waves were in Normandy-style Higgins boats that got hung up on that reef. Not only did these follow-on waves suffer a terrible slaughter while wading 1,000 yards through neck-deep water, but the initial waves were also left for hours pinned on a beach without support. Yard for yard, tiny Tarawa is some of the costliest ground in World War II. Interestingly, the mistakes of Tarawa prompted the Navy to start sending in elite, scuba-equipped reconnaissance teams to get a good look at actual coastal conditions before the invasion. Later, these so-called frogmen would start blowing up these beach defenses, giving them the name of UDTs, or Underwater Demolition Teams, later to evolve into the Sea, Air, and Land, or SEAL teams we know so well. If you're ever wondering where the SEALs actually come from, look to Bloody Tarawa. Okay, let's get to the gaming table. The good news is that most island hopping battles were, in terms of manpower, quite small. Avoiding huge ground battles, remember, was half the point of island hopping in the first place. This means systems like Flames of War or the new Pacific expansions for Battlegroup would work great for Pacific island hopping battles. These engagements are also primarily infantry battles, which means even skirmish games like Bolt Action would work as well. Although these tables would be quite large to represent the average company or battalion scale engagement typical of these battles, so pack a lunch. Pacific island hopping battles, and thus their games, differ in some key aspects from European-style amphibious games with which many players might be familiar. 1. There's never any surprise. These islands are very small, and landing beaches are limited, so there's no room for the Pas-de-Calais fake-out like we saw at Normandy. Also, Japanese defenses are much better prepared than anything dreamed of along the Atlantic Wall, requiring days or even weeks of shelling and bombardment instead of the surprise hour or two that we saw at Normandy. 2. There's no infrastructure. These islands were very underdeveloped in World War II, so forget about taking roads, bridges, docks, or little French or Italian towns. Any American landing force should include plenty of engineers, including Navy Seabees or construction battalions. Airfields are often a key target, but pretty much anything the Americans want here, they'll have to build here, or rebuild at the very least. 3. There is no armored breakout, with tanks pouring ashore to mount that key assault through a breach opened by infantry, artillery, and air power. These islands are just too small, and there's never enough geography for the battle to reach that deep battle scope. While the Americans did use tanks in these battles, these were strictly for infantry support. Shermans mounted with 105mm assault howitzers or even flamethrowers were usually more valuable than the standard M4, and there was nothing like the Easy 8 or the Firefly. Japanese tanks, by comparison, were absolute trash. Their army was built to fight a war in China, who basically didn't have any tanks at all. 4. Forget the jungle. Yeah, I know that sounds strange, but unless you're island hopping in the South Pacific or the Philippines, the Central Pacific Coral Atoll Islands were surprisingly bare. Sure, there will be scatterings of palm trees for your table, but none of the Vietnam-style green hell like you see at Bougainville or New Britain. 5. There is no victory for the Japanese. Seriously, forget it. The Japanese will always lose the battle. American numbers, fire support, and airstrikes are just too much. Victory conditions therefore need to allow the Japanese player to win the game by forcing the Americans to take every single strong point, take it in a certain amount of time, all while taking just too many casualties. Japanese infantry and support weapons were also surprisingly poor, underpowered, and also desperately short in supply. The Japanese army's reputation as tough fighters doesn't come from their equipment, just their absolute refusal to surrender, and the sheer depth, intricacy, and cunning of their fortifications. Seriously, set up your table so that no Japanese position can be attacked or even seen, let alone assaulted, without drawing reaction fire from at least 2 others. 6. The Pacific Island Hopping War uses different equipment. While European landings were carried out with various versions of the familiar Higgins boats, Pacific assaults were almost always spearheaded by the LVT, Landing Vehicle Tract, also called the Amphibious Tractor or Amtrak. Originally a work vehicle in the Florida Everglades, these were built in a wide variety of marks, models, and variants. Their importance in the Pacific War cannot be overstated. Rather than just unload their troops in the open surf, Amtraks would crawl up onto the beach and debark Marines from under armor and suppressive fire. Later versions would have 75mm assault howitzers or turrets based on the M3, M5 light tank, and they were just as happy operating on land as they were at sea. They are thin-skinned, however, so for assaulting a really tough Japanese position, a flame-throwing Sherman is still the best bet. And finally, don't forget other phases of the battle. The general procedure for one of these assaults included days or even weeks of air and naval bombardment, so make sure that your table has plenty of craters, damaged bunkers, and charred trees. For a change of pace, consider a night skirmish between Navy UDTs and Japanese defenders before the main invasion. Speaking of night battles, the Japanese would sometimes launch desperate banzai bayonet charges once they realized the overall battle was truly lost. These became a rarity later in the war, however, as even the Japanese army realized their futility. Also bear in mind the engineering that has to take place after the battle, so the Japanese player might get more victory points for knocking out a Navy CB bulldozer than a Marine Sherman. Japanese naval and air formations might also interfere with the landing, opening up a whole new operational scope for your campaign, as we see with the Solomons, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Marianas. Finally, the Southern and Central Pacific drives would meet up at the Philippines, where island hopping was again employed to attack only those islands, or parts of islands, really needed to neutralize a large Japanese garrison. From there, it was on to Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa, which in some ways was an even bigger amphibious operation than Overlord. The biggest and bloodiest of all would have been the Operation Downfall landings on Japan itself, scheduled for October 45 and March of 46. Fortunately, these were never needed in the wake of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the end of the war on September 2nd, 1945. So that will finally conclude our Op Center series on the Pacific War. Even with all 4 episodes, I'm afraid I've only given you the barest taste of the true scope and complexity of the Pacific War. With ground invasions, naval gunnery battles, submarines, carrier operations, engineering, logistics, special forces, and at the end even nuclear weapons, there's literally never been another war like it. But seriously, we have to call it here. I really hope you've enjoyed these videos and maybe got some ideas or inspiration for gaming World War II across the Blue Pacific. For now, this is Ariskany, and as always, Tango Mike for listening.